All right, so hello everyone. My name is Jakub Wal, and I'm Senior QA Engineer in gravity9. And today we are going to talk about WebUI testing. So first of all, we are going to kick off with some basics of the concept of the web app architecture. Later on, we'll move to the working with the graphical designs. Next, we'll touch the topic of the user experience and user interface testing essentials. And last but not least, we are going to talk about the front-end performance. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask, interrupt me. Of course, there will be also some short Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so it's all up to you. So when it comes to the web application structure, so basically, most of the modern web applications are built of three layers, which is obviously front-end, back-end, and database. In most of the cases, the structure is much more complex. So for example, there could be some server-side rendered front-ends. Also, the database could not exist at all. So for example, the back-end can work with some third-party integrations solely. But yeah, it's all up to the project. If we take a closer look at what is actually the front end, so the front end is, let's call it some kind of user-friendly presentation layer of our application. Let's say it's going to be the web application. So it's built of some user interface components, and it's responsible for handling a user's interaction and to pass them later to the backend. So it can be processed with its logic. The backend handles, as I said before, backend handles the application business logic. It's responsible for processing the requests from the front end, so which is the really basic definition of the API. And as I said before, it might interact with the databases and other external third-party services. So diving deeper into the front-end architecture, there are many different approaches in the front-end solutions, but I think the most popular ones are actually monolith structure and micro front-end structure. So it's not really needed from you, I mean from the QA, to fully understand how does the architecture look like and how does it work, but I think it's beneficial to know at least how it looks like, I mean, let's say from the very, very first sight. It's good to know just because it will be good to you to test it efficiently, actually. So yeah, obviously it's also good to have an access to the front-end code repository to be able at least read it and understand what was changed or what was the subject of the most recent changes. So actually testing new feature between those two structures is pretty much the same. So it doesn't really differ because I think it's pretty straightforward if you are testing something new. However, it might be quite different if you are going to test the regression. So I believe that testing regression in monolith structure this is pretty simple thing. So you directly know what was changed, and it's easy to run, let's say, some regular regression tests or even targeted ones. But when it comes to testing the regression in micro front-end structure, well, it might be inefficient to go with full regression and, let's say, test all three services like A, B, and C whenever the change was done only in the A. So, for example, you don't want to test, let's say, payments or card or other stuff like the bookstore when there was a change only done in the, let's say, login page or any other one that wasn't touched at all. However, as I said before, the structure might be more complex. So there could be some shared libraries across, let's say, A, B, and C services. So that could be some front-end library that could have been changed. So yeah, it might have some actual impact on all of those three services. So yeah, this is all up to QAs to identify what was changed and to make sure that everything is properly tested. So if we are going to dive deeper into web user interface, so actually there are many different interfaces in the web applications. However, for our purpose, we are going to touch only the graphical user interface. So this is basically, as I said before, user-friendly representation of the software that allows, let's say, some user or customer interactions with our web app using some visual content. So subject of testing the web UI, as I said before, this is also touching and testing the graphical representation, testing the functionalities, testing the UI components like the inputs, buttons, even more complex ones like forms or widgets or grid of elements which are built of many different UI components. Testing web UI involves not only checking the functionality and the graphical representation itself. So it might also involve testing the usability, accessibility testing, which is going to be covered later by Marta's presentation, and cross-platform compatibility testing as well. So first of all, when we are testing the front ends, we need some kind of documentation. So the documentation can be either, let's say, it might be even Excel spreadsheet, but yeah, this is some kind of document that we have to base on when testing the front ends, obviously. And also, not only the specification, because actually there also can be some designs created in modern applications, like the Figma or Zeppelin. So just to be able to work efficiently, first of all, we have to start from gathering some non-functional requirements. So this is crucial for us, just to make sure we will cover all required devices that are going to be supported by our web application. It also gives us some view on which screen resolutions should be tested. So yeah, we can test our front-end implementation for the responsiveness. And next, obviously QAs need to sync up, or at least try do that with developers and QAs, just to make sure that they agree on the approach on the designs, and they will align their approach to the designs, just to make sure there won't be any cases that QAs are treating the designs as some kind of the blueprints, or raising the issues that shouldn't be raised because actually the front-end developer wasn't developing it that way. I mean, they didn't want it to do the strictly way. So yeah, it's also worth to sync with your team. So when it comes to sticking to the designs, actually there are many different approaches, but I think that in most of the cases you can either use the designs as some kind of the guidelines, and you should probably never be strictly connected to that. I mean, the implementation shouldn't be done in some kind of the strict way. So it doesn't have to look exactly like the designs. But in some projects, the designs are, let's say, treated as some kind of the blueprints. So all the functionalities are based on the designs. So not only the graphical representation, but also how the application should behave and other stuff. Many of you might have heard about something that is called pixel-perfect approach. So this is something different that you will probably find on the internet, but everyone is talking about the pixel-perfect approach when it comes to the working with the designs. So actually, this is something that we should be careful with when working, because actually, well, this is making sure that the implementation is precisely done as the design. So is it good? Is it bad? Well, it's up to you and up to the project, because actually if some designers created, let's say, some margins or some paddings for, let's say, the form component, I think they've done it for some kind of the purpose, just to maybe display more data or maybe display crucial data at the top of that form. So yeah, it might have a reason. So it might be also worth to be strict sometimes. So first of all, we are going to start with some example in here. So as you can see, we've got some contact us form. So on the left-hand side, we've got some designs. On the right-hand side, there is actual implementation of it. So at the very, very first side, this is pretty much the same, as you can see. However, if you dive deeper into it, you might notice some slight changes, I mean, slight differences. So first of all, the contact us header, I'm not really sure if you're going to see it, but actually the actual implementation has different font weight. Yeah, so it's hardly, it can be hardly ever noticed by the client. But yeah, this is true actually. And also the vertical padding between the input fields is also different if you compare the actual implementation against the designs. There's also one missing required field label, but that was actually added after some user acceptance testing phase on client's request. So I believe that this is beneficial for QAs to be able to at least inspect elements in the design tools like the Figma or the Zeppelin, just to be able to retrieve all the data about the properties, about the forms or other UI components that we are going to test later. Just to be able to compare that with the CSS attributes, for example, in the developer tools, yeah? This is how I believe that you should be able to get like the basic properties, or to be able to measure the distances to make sure that, for example, the paddings or the margins are correctly implemented. So on the left, there are designs. And on the right side, there's an actual implementation. So as you can see, we've got the vertical padding of the 35 pixels on the designs, but the actual one was 24. So I wouldn't consider this as a bug, because actually the form looks totally fine. It's readable, nothing overlaps. Maybe if something else would be added, like some additional validations or tooltips or any other things, that could be an issue, because actually it might start overlapping with the, let's say, the first names can start overlapping with the email address. But in our case, and for the contact us form, not really. So this is totally fine. Also, I also wanted to present you that you can inspect almost everything. So not only the dimensions of the UI components, like the buttons or maybe the inputs, but also you can retrieve all the information that you need. So for example, you can get the paddings, as I said before, the font's properties, like the weight, the font, actual, what is going to be used, the size of it. So this is worth, if you see, you can actually inspect it very easily in the developer tools. So not only using the brief look, so when you hover over the element, but you can also take a further look and take a look what was in the actual implementation. And of course, obviously compare that against, and if there are any issues, and those are the valid issues, you can raise them. So when it comes to testing the UI components, so there are different stages of that process. So first of all, obviously you need to run some smoke tests just to ensure the functionality is fully implemented, so we can proceed with the whole user journey, just to be able to test it fully. Next one, you have to start comparing the implementation against the designs. So on the right-hand side, you can actually see the example page layout. So if you notice, some of the information, the sensitive one has to be blurred, but this is a real example. So actually you can see the top bar, which contains some basic navigation, which is blurred, unfortunately, but there is also some user profile widget. The so-called body of that page contains some grid of elements, which might contain some widgets and other stuff, and each that widget can be totally autonomous, so they might have any different functionalities implemented in there. And on the bottom, you can actually see there is a simple footer. So if this is all good, I mean, even at the very first sight, I believe that you can proceed further and start breaking down the whole sets of the UI features into smaller components. So just to be able to test it fully and efficiently. And I think that the last stage, which is actual proper testing, so you have to check all the UI elements against some specifications, acceptance criteria defined in the tasks or user stories, verify that against the implementation. So for example, for, let's say, some input fields, the button, etc. So at the bottom, actually you can see that if you take, let's say, whole functionality, and you will just distinguish that there are, let's say, 3 inputs in there as our set of the inputs, and you want to test it against the implementation. So it's obviously good to be focused on that. So actually, as you can see, in that case, we were testing the validations of faulty users' input, and it's pretty obvious to see that the email, unfortunately, didn't trigger the validation error message. So that was a valid bug, actually, that should be raised later. So diving deeper into our examples. So as you can see, we've got some basic page with some left-hand side navigation. There is also top bar. There's also some search in the right upper corner. But yeah, a lot is going on in there. First of all, we've got some header with some icon. There are multiple inputs down below. There are 2 actionable buttons. Later on, we can see that there is some list, some table with results, probably returned from the search query, which is pretty obvious. And down below, at the bottom, we've got some pagination component. So yeah, a lot is going on in there. So let's start breaking down this into smaller components. So at the top, you can actually see that there is some, let's call it the search component. So it's built of the header, multiple inputs, 2 buttons actually, which are actionable ones. So based on the user's input, the proper query should be built and executed once the search button is hit. And it should result in returning some results, but it will be tested later. So it's easy to predict how it should behave and how to create the proper test cases to test it properly. So, for example, you can see we got the first name, the last name. So we expect that both of those fields are going to be the, let's say, text fields that are not going to be that strictly validated. But then when it goes to the date of the birth, yeah, this might be quite different because actually it would expect some kind of the format. As well as it goes for the email, so there should be probably some regex validation for that. And for example, the phone number would only accept the digits. So as you can see, there's also date picker embedded in the date of birth input. So yeah, this is another subject of, let's say, some other scenario that should be tested. So if either the user's input, I mean the typed date of birth, will also work as well as the one that is picked up manually from the date picker. If you go further, you can see a very basic table with some search results. So you would probably expect that table to, let's say, look good on various screen sizes. So it's, let's say, at least some kind of responsive design. So it's looking on various screens, but not only the display. I mean, it's not only the subject of testing, that component, because actually it might be also actionable. So you might sort the results, so you would probably expect if those are sorted properly. You can also click on any item just to reveal more information. There could be even some other buttons that would allow you to interact with the elements, like the edit or maybe the delete. So yeah, this is a lot of stuff to test, but actually, I think the representation is the most part, because actually you want to make sure that the data is readable and you can retrieve all the information just at once. So yeah, it's easy for the users to work with the tables and such kind of information. The last one is actually the pagination component. So it's responsible for navigating through different pages of the results that were returned by our search query. So there are multiple buttons and also some select component just to pick some rows per page to display more or less data. So yeah, it's also worth to check this one separately because bugs tend to cluster in this area. So yeah, it's worth taking a look.
I've got a question.
Yes, go ahead.
So what kind of tools you are using to check this UI? Like only dev tools built into the browser, you know, or you've got some other tool?
Okay, so the question was what kind of tools we are using. Yes?
Because I've listened to a podcast, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
And they were saying that these tools built into the browser,
mm-hmm.
you know, that you can change your phone or, you know,
mm-hmm.
they aren't relevant to real. Some are, some don't.
Okay.
My question is if you've got any tool.
Okay, so the question was what kind of the tools are used in testing the web UI, as you said, responsiveness, yeah, okay, responsive implementation. So to be honest, it's the very best way to test it on real devices. But we know this is impossible in most of the projects, so we don't have the real devices. Yes, so this is pretty hard because actually you can work on the browser stack, but those devices are emulated. So these are not the real devices. So actually, I think the very beginning of such testing should involve, let's say, testing the web browser, so you can actually emulate the view. You can click, I think this is the second icon in the developer tools, and you can actually change the resolution. You can pick up anything just to even start testing if it's working fine. Because if there will be any issues in that, I think those can be only discovered on real devices. Yeah. So I think this is good to point out to the client, to the team, or to, let's say, the company that we are working in, that we actually need the real device to test it properly, because you won't have 100%, let's say, coverage of your tests and everything if you test it on emulated devices. So yeah, actually, if it comes to the tools, there are no actually any other ones that are proposed by, let's say, the browser stacks and other ones on the market, because actually this is some kind of visual representation. So you have to take a look on that, and you have to see. So yeah. Unfortunately, you have to start fighting for the real devices.
Start business, yeah? Start business, buy out of phones, yeah? And
actually, some of the providers and other, let's say, companies, they tend to say that they have got the real devices, but in most of the cases, yeah, unfortunately, that's not true. So we are working on emulated ones. Go ahead.
About another kind of tools which can simplify our work. For example, if I want to measure distance between two elements, not only padding, but real distance, what can you suggest for this?
Okay, so if you would like to measure the distance, it's not that easy, because actually it would depend on the resolution you are working on and on the designs, because actually we have to compare that against something. So you cannot think, okay, this should be like 500 pixels. You have to compare it against some kind of the designs just to make sure it's implemented as requested, because you actually have to base on something. You cannot be the designer, the QA, and the front-end developer just to make up with everything and to be able to work. And as a measuring, well, I personally use actually the developer tools and the CSS attributes. So actually, I can check the padding itself. But when it comes to measuring some other devices and maybe some other length, well, that's some kind of an edge case for me. So I believe that I once done this in my career, but this is not something that I'm usually used to do it. So I cannot give you any example of that tool. Okay. Okay, so let's jump to another part. So as you remember the diagram from our very beginning, the front end is, let's say, always connected with the back end. So this is pretty important when testing the web UIs to check if the communication between these two layers, the front end and the back end, let's say, is properly implemented. So we need to ensure, for example, if all info passed in the forms is correctly mapped to the HTTP request payload, and obviously if it's sent and saved correctly in the database. So we should also make sure that we test some negative scenarios when, for example, faulty or no input is provided. So for example, we've got some kind of the form and there's no user input required, so we can leave it empty. So we would probably expect it to either pass a null value or not to exist in the payload at all. However, most of the implementations tend to send, like, let's say, empty strings. But unfortunately, in some kind of the logic, it might be faulty data saved in our database, because there is some record which is not null, but it's not meaningless it's meaningless to us. Also, you should also validate if the HTTP response fields are properly displayed in the UIs. So if it's also properly handled when it comes with some kind of errors returned, server-side ones or client ones, so if it's properly handled by, let's say, some kind of snack bars or any other graphical user representations, as well as, for example, the tables, if the tables are populated correctly with all the data that is returned. Sometimes it requires you to, it is required from you to test the application under some required state. For example, to expose proper error handling. So most of us are testing the applications on live environments. So triggering an error there is pretty impossible unless you know how to reproduce some issue and there is an actual unfixed bug which can cause some, let's say, issue on the back end, and it will result in 500 responses from one of the, let's say, endpoints. However, you can actually mock the HTTP request, and I believe this is a very good tool to use. You can actually save a lot of time because you don't have to find a way how to manually change the response status code or even start working locally on your front ends and mock the responses in there, because actually you can intercept the request. Obviously, you can only do that when it's exposed in the network tab. So you can intercept that and mock the status code of the response. You can also mock the response body. So this is pretty powerful tool to work on. As you can see on the example, we intercepted some customers searching and paging. So this is some kind of the results list. So all we need to provide is the HTTP method, which is the post in our scenario, and simply just mock the status code, which is 500. And once it's intercepted, you will see that it's intercepted, and this is all done on the live environment. As you can see, it was properly handled by some error message saying that the service is not working, so please try again later. But this is the very basic example, because actually, as I said before, you can not only mock the status codes, you can also mock the the response payload. So, for example, imagine that there is some kind of grid of elements that you are adding manually. So you can add up to 5 or 10, but how long does it take? I mean, it might take like forever to create for example, one resource or one item. But you can just duplicate that, put it in the response payload, and you will populate your component with some with some, let's say, fake data. But the front end should handle it properly. Obviously, if we are sticking to the criteria that it was implemented against. But yeah, it allows us working with some kind of such cases. So whenever we are testing the frontends or so-called UIs, you can encounter many different issues which are not really that covered by some specifications or designs or acceptance criteria. So I believe this is a great area for QAs to step in and actually to take the lead, because if you are a person that is responsible for the quality of product that you are working on, it's good to write some user experience or user interface improvements, let's say based on your previous experiences with the application, or maybe other web applications that you had worked with before. So, for example, you want to make sure that your application is kept in a consistent way of the UI elements across, let's say, many different pages. So, for example, we've got the page A, which displays a table, and you would probably expect it to be exactly the same on the page B. So it would feel and act and look exactly the same, because this is actually what that you want to achieve. So it also takes you to checking the asynchronous actions, so with the proper graphical representation. So in our example, this is the loader component that is indicating that there is some process done in the background by the backend, or maybe the database is saving something. So yeah, so it's a very good way to handle all the, let's say, actions that should say to our customers or users, okay, just wait a minute. Once it's progressed or once it's processed, we'll just let you know and take you somewhere else. So going further, streamlining user navigation is also worth checking if it's consistent and it works as expected, and users are following some predefined user journeys just to make sure that they are, let's say, experiencing the most from our application. So as an example, you can see some simple page that we've got some list in here. We've got some create some kind of resource button in that upper right corner. So after clicking that button, the modal window is opened. So this is some kind of wizard. So all you have to do provide some input. Once you are done and you are on the last step, there is a create button displayed. So once it's clicked, you would probably expect that there will be some kind of loader displayed, indicating that okay, everything is going to be saved. Later on, you would probably expect it that the loader will be gone, the dialog window will be closed, and the user will be taken back again to that page with the list component, and your added resource will appear on the top of the list. So it might not be defined in the specifications, but this is something that you probably feel. It should behave like that. So this is a good area to raise actual using UX, UI improvements whenever you need to. So regression tests are integral part of the testing process. So you can define either regular regression tests, which includes a whole set of test suites and test cases, just testing all UI elements, across our whole application. So you probably know that this is really time-consuming, and it might be intensive for the resources, unfortunately. It can lead even up to some bottlenecks in the release process. So it's quite inefficient, I believe. However, if you know at least some basics of your micro frontends or even the whole application structure and the architecture, you can actually try using something called targeted regression tests. So, as I said before, this is some kind of selective UI testing of the components that were touched by the changes. So instead of testing the whole application, you can actually, based on the changes and the knowledge of the services, you can actually identify some areas that are exposed to the changes, might interfere with the changes, so there could be some potential regression introduced, and you can actually test those almost immediately. So this gives us a little bit faster testing cycle. So instead of going through whole application, you can test something, improve that there's no regression, and deploy that right to the production. And actually it works, because I tried that several times in the project, and yeah, we were able to release like immediately after checking that everything works fine. However, it's also worth to run at least some basic regression tests, even automated ones, just to make sure that nothing got broken, because actually if we overlook the issues, overlooked an areas that should be tested, it might went bad. It might go bad because actually there will be some regression introduced. Going next to the front-end performance testing. So whenever you hear of performance testing, you will probably think Google Lighthouse. And this is actually true, because testing front-end performance, well, testing front-end performance when it comes to the manual testing, this is a pretty hard thing to do, because actually it's even almost impossible to test it manually, and you have to aid up with some automated tools. So Google Lighthouse, I believe this is a good choice, at least to start with. So the testing front-end performance, so actually this is checking how good or bad our application loads in the user's browsers. So yeah, this is also a client-side thing. So the users expect our applications or pages to load immediately. So they wanted to have it just like now, without any additional wait time. So they want to see all the, let's say, results, all the things, especially if this is some public public exposed application, so e-commerce ones, for example, it has a crucial impact on the business. Business-related statistics, actually, so the bounce rate, as well as generating leads and even generating some customers. So this is quite important thing to do, just to make to test actually. So it can be divided into two, let's say, two different things. So the first one is the ad hoc performance test. I think if anyone has done something like that, have met with something that was done on the ad hoc, so those are actually conducted manually on the demand. For example, before the Black Friday season or maybe some holiday season, so the clients want to make sure that their application is working like lightning. The second one is the regular performance tests. So those are conducted automatically. Those could be tied with the CI/CD actually. So whenever there's a change to the code, we deploy, for example, to the production and run, let's say, the Google Lighthouse actually can be run there. You can gather the statistics, compare that with the previous implementation and see if it went better or worse. However, when it comes to testing the front-end performance, it's not only running the tool and hoping it's going to be all green, and the score is like 100, and everything they're displaying, I mean, all the metrics will be green. So actually, it's much more, and it requires you to gain at least some basic knowledge. For example, what is the FCP, what is the LCP, how's the blocking time measured, or what are the layout shifts. So after you gain that knowledge, you should also be able to connect that with the UI components that are responsible for. So most of the tools will tell you that, okay, this is the UI component that is behaving, let's say, bad, and it should be improved. But you should probably know that what are these metrics responsible for. So what are they actually measuring? Just to be able to test it efficiently, because sometimes it's not even worth to, let's say, gain like 2 points in the performance test, because actually something has to work that way. But obviously you can work on some other metrics, and maybe some other components or other stuff in that is also measured and gives us, for example, the worse statistics. Performance testing is not only running the tools with, let's say, Google Lighthouse. It also requires from the QAs to constantly monitor the application. So the behavior of the application, actually. So we need to make sure that our application runs smoothly, no matter if it's dealing, let's say, with a form that contains 3 input elements or even dozens of those. So we should make sure that it's working smoothly whenever it's dealing with, let's say, 2 items or maybe hundreds of those displayed on that. As an example, you can see there is a page that contains some lists of the elements of the models, actually. So this is a real scenario. When there were like up to 20 models, everything worked fine. I was able to proceed through that page. I was able to complete with the user journey. The browser was behaving totally fine. However, when the automated tests were adding more and more models, and I was adding them manually, obviously, it started to behave, I mean, odd to me. So it was starting to getting slower and slower. I wasn't even able to proceed further, for example, to reveal all the data or edit the data, because actually it was of the inappropriate resource handling. So once the models were added, so that page included like the list of all models that were added for that user. So if there were like 20, it was fine, but if there were like 100 of those, it started to slow down a little bit, and eventually it caused the crashes of the Chrome. So I wasn't even able to proceed further. So that was because the backend, which returned the results immediately, started to fill up the resources. You could easily see that in the networks table, and the frontend had a hard time trying to display all the data and reveal all the details and, for example, display all the images. So it was solved in a very, let's say, simple way, because actually as you might notice, it required the pagination component. I mean, it required the pagination approach, and once we set the pagination at the fixed size of the 20, it was totally fine. I was able to proceed further. So sometimes it's worth to monitor the application, and sometimes it's worth to not always remove all the data, because as you see, this only occurred when we were talking about like several hundred of models, which was a totally valid case because we were expecting the users to add something like that. So some of the performance issues are not strictly connected with the front end. So these could be also connected with the backend. So yeah, those are the race conditions. So the race condition occurs when we've got some kind of component that relies on some kind of source of the truth. But actually there's like two streams of source of the truth. So whenever, let's say there are two of those, so depending on which one is resolved first, the state of the components depends on that. Sounds like totally magic, but I will just explain how it looks on some hands-on example, actually. So as you can see, we've got some progress bar component displaying some percentage, and let's say those are numbers of questions that were answered. So on the left-hand side, there is actual result, so we can see the percentage, the number of the questions from the form. On the right-hand side, there is a 0% and 0 questions. So that is the expected result because the user didn't have enough privileges to view that detail. So that was, let's say, some sensitive data, and it had to be 0% like all the time. So for most of the scenarios, it was totally fine. It was displayed as a 0%. That was because of the myInfo request. So that myInfo request came whenever we reached our page for the very first time. So after logging in, navigating to the home page, myInfo came back. MyInfo was requested, and the response that came back was the required values were stored in the local storage of the browser, and when you proceed further, those information was retrieved, so it was checking, okay, you are not privileged, so we are going to display 0% to you with no questions exposed. But if the user would decide to save that page as a bookmark, or maybe even hard refresh that page, they would end up with some kind of the race condition between the myInfo request and the second one, which is the, let's say, form request. So depending on which one was resolved first, it either displayed or didn't display that, that global progress percentage. So it occurred like 1 in 20 times for me, but that was a valid issue actually. So locally it didn't occur at all. So trying to investigate and reproduce the issue might be really painful, but I believe this is worth, because actually we don't want our application to display some sensitive data when we don't want to, and when it's handled by the front end, because we have to consider that that actually was handled solely by the front end. So actually it was fixed by proper handling on the use effect hook from the React, just to make sure that the user info is properly inserted there.
Is it the right fix for that? Because I'm thinking of the security on the front end side. You can easily modify it in the browser and you can see everything. So why it was not solved on the backend side? Because this data should not be accessible, as you said.
I mean, you cannot that easily modify that to be able to reveal the data.
It's not easy, but you see, you told that that this information about the privileges was retrieved like later, after the resources were already like on the client side. Why do you do the security on the client?
So actually, that progress bar was only calculated by the front end. So you wouldn't be able to do that when dealing with the backend requests.
Yes, but in this case, once you write the request for the resources from the backend, you should be, you should not get the resources, and then the front end on the React side should simply display that okay, you have a 0, and it should not be, it's like it's the incorrect approach.
Yeah, you are totally right. This should be all totally handled by the backend, actually, by the business logic. And yeah, this is something that is also worth mentioning, that the front end should be only responsible for displaying the things, not doing any calculations, because sometimes it might get really weird when the front end is doing the calculations, including the back end is doing some of those.
Imagine the situation, and it happens, often in the application, that someone, instead of using your browser, will start to use endpoints, and then can get the data which is sensitive, and this is like a super risky.
Yeah, this is totally right. So encouraging your team just to move with some, let's say, calculations from the front end to the back end is the right thing to do, especially if you have enough, let's say, power to do so, because sometimes nobody listens to QA because of some reasons. But yeah, that's right. This should be handled solely by the backend and should not only depend. But yeah, this is some kind of race condition, and just wanted to show you how it can be investigated and what is the cause and how it looks like, just to understand what is it. Because actually, I personally use that. Let's say that words, I mean, race conditions many times, not even understanding what does it mean and where it comes from.
But the question is not about where to do calculation, but to let user get information from who can or still don't let.
Yeah.
It's not depends on where calculation performance.
Yeah, that is also right. So doing the calculations on the back end is probably the best way to do, and retrieving that data and displaying on the front end solely. I mean, to do that.
Like, it depends what kind of data you're getting, yeah? Because imagine that you have to calculate, every single time, like percentage in sending request, yeah? I think some calculation, if it's not like really sensitive data, you can do on the front end.
Yes.
Because performance will be down. Yeah? That's another issue. It depends what kind of data you're sending.
And for example, with 3D modeling, it's better to make calculation on the front end because it's a lot of calculations, and you don't need to move through network so many data.
Yes, and actually there might be even other example that the backend doesn't know about, let's say, those questions, because those are provided as some JSON, so they don't know how many of those are, because this is some kind of third party. So the only way to, let's say, calculate those things is to do that on the front end, because the backend doesn't really know about that.
Okay.
Yeah, this is also okay. So many different cases. Okay, so I guess this is it. If you have any questions, you could ask, but maybe you can also ask me later. So I believe that we can have our little break now for the 10 minutes. So yeah, I think 7:10, we should all meet here. Thank you.